Really, Mark, that was fantastic. A lot of really good information. I look forward to actually looking at your books as well. So thank you for that. And it's great to see everyone here. I've been lucky enough. I didn't coming out of college, growing up. I didn't know about affordable housing. I didn't think about affordable housing. And just I'm a CPA by trade, but really early on in my career, I was lucky enough. I call myself lucky enough to start working with affordable housing developers, nonprofits, for-profits, public housing authorities. I just fell in love with the ideas of what we've all talked about today, the need that's out there, putting together the resources and so forth. So I'm thank the organizers today for having me here today to really talk about what are opportunities for faith-based groups around housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, some financing ideas, things like that, and really reiterating some things that Mark talked about next steps and so forth. So feel free to ask questions as we go. Feel free to follow up with me anytime. I love this. I've been in this 25 years, and I spent a lot of time working with nonprofits, emerging developers, and so forth. So excited to be here. Just the agenda today, again, really, I want to even start with talking about, I know we've talked a lot about affordable housing. A lot of people have different definitions of what is affordable housing. I'll kind of get into that here in Dane County. I'll talk about, Mark talked about even using assets. I'll talk about development, a lot of my slides, but how about using your resources or community resources to acquire and preserve affordable housing? We see so many times, not to pick on for-profit developers, but buying an existing apartment that has moderate level rents, buying it, sprucing up just a little bit, and raising rents $300, $400, which takes away affordability. So talk about acquisitions, talk about new construction here in the state and across the country. Low-income housing tax credits are one of the biggest tools to create large-scale affordable housing development. And just talk about you as a faith-based group, maybe a nonprofit, strengths, considerations, and next steps. It's really starting out and even defining, let's see here. How to advance, oh, there, okay, here we go, okay. One more slide. Should be pointing there, okay, there we go. So, sorry about that. So we're really defining, where we are generally speaking. People, and again, these definitions vary, and there's no right or wrong answer. But generally speaking, workforce housing, what's workforce housing? And typically, when I talk about workforce housing, is people may be earning 60 to 100% of the area median income. And that might be, different. I've heard up to 120%. So again, this is just reference here in Dane County based on 2022 data and so forth. So people, a family of two at that 60% level, it's about $55,000 of income. And then 100%, meaning the average Dane County income for a family of two is $92,000. And a lot of time it's interesting, it's referred to as the missing middle. I know we talk about, there's needs all over, right? Very low income, middle income, this missing middle and so forth. And then we talk about affordable housing, which typically is defined as under 60% of the area median income. Again, someone at 50%, family to 46,000, someone at 30% AMI at around 27,000. And just some interesting numbers too. Kurt talked about, is the average house $350,000, $400,000 in Dane County? So I just said, okay, if I have a mortgage at $350,000, today's or yesterday's average interest rate was 6.44%. Again, if some of you are lucky enough to get in the 2s and 3s. So if you had a $350,000 mortgage, principal interest, real estate taxes, insurance, that's about $32,000, $33,000 a year. Look at that compared to if you're making $55,000, even $92,000, obviously $33,000 is more than a third. In the housing industry we talk about, no one should, probably pay, the goal is no more than 30% of their income on housing. Even an average house for someone at 100% of the AMI is paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So it's a level, affordability level really at all levels of income except for the very wealthy people. We see even the rent, again, we talked about the average rent, and Kurt mentioned this, it's almost $1,400 for a one bedroom is the average overall rent in Dane County. Two bedroom is $1,650, $1,700. Again, at $1,700, that's almost $20,000 a year of rent. Compare that to those income levels, and you can see how unaffordable Dane County is in general. Now talk about acquisitions. Again, we talked a lot about affordability. So sorry about that. But one interesting thing are opportunities to acquire. We see far too often, again, in the affordable housing world, is properties, again, maybe they were previously financed with federal financing or low-income housing tax credits, or maybe a term in the industry we call is, naturally occurring affordable housing. You might have heard there's no property naturally occurring affordable housing. And again, maybe it's investor. We talked about investment bankers coming in and, the capitalists want to make money, that's fine. But again, maybe taking that and putting $5,000 in renovations in and raising rents. We see that very often. So how about using resources in this community to acquire and preserve affordability? One big type of affordable property is, I'm going to touch on tax credits. There's this 15-year life cycle, but then in 15 years, many times there might be a transaction. This is a property on the east side of Madison, just as an example. Again, if we can get the slides out to everyone, there's a nice link there. Really, almost every affordable housing property in Dane County area will be there. Hey, if I want to buy something, call the owner up, call a broker up, and see if it's available. Kind of very similarly, so there's tax credits. These are, this is what I call a naturally occurring affordable housing. This is also in Madison. Maybe something built in the 70s or 80s. Rent's probably lower than those averages I showed you. So again, there's no current federal or state or tax credit use restriction agreement on it. But again, it's renting to people of incomes in those stratus. And why not buy this and preserve this and kind of put a land use restriction agreement yourself on it? What a great way to preserve that affordability. We know we need new units, but we can't lose units. That's the thing. We're losing, honestly, thousands of units, hundreds of units as an industry a year to the market rate. So preservation's almost equally as important as new construction. And then just briefly, sorry about that too. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but follow up with me on this. There's really, really interesting financing available. And some of you might be familiar with what are called 501c3 bonds available for owners of multifamily housing, affordable housing that are 100% nonprofit owned. I won't get into all the terms, but extremely attractive terms and rates. 40-year amortizations, very long interest-only periods, which gets obviously more debt sizing. We've seen some acquisitions, 100% finance. Again, it's the risk tolerance, but 100% financed by debt. No equity out of your own pocket. Again, you might not want that kind of leverage, but just know there's opportunities there. Mark noted a lot of maybe capital that's out there that's more ESG focused, social impact and so forth. And I can definitely direct you to some of these groups. There are national groups that are in affordable housing but have capital equity available for these types of projects, both acquisitions and new construction. And I love just this one case, Enterprise. I mentioned Enterprise on the screen. Let's say if I'm a market rate investor, just to give you a ballpark, I may want on an annual rate 8% return on my money. That's 7-8%, maybe it's 6-8%. Enterprise has this product. They get their money from banks and insurance companies and socially minded entities. And they say, you know what, we might only need 3 or 4% return on our money. But what I'm going to do with that balance, I still want a deal that's going to have cash flow. And I'm going to actually put a program together that's going to pay that extra return to the tenants. Right? If you're a good tenant, you're paying your rent on time, let's actually funnel some money back to tenants. And there's a lot of programs out there that are really neat, that are really about self-sufficiency and kind of helping move tenants forward in their life. There's also, you think about credit scores and things like that, and that's obviously one big thing. We talked about, there's not a lot of single-family homes available or affordable, but even credit scores. Credit scores are difficult or to raise or maybe not high enough when you're trying to get a loan to borrow. There's a great program. The company's name is Isusu, and what they've done is worked with some of the larger mortgage companies. They work with the credit agencies. Like typically, if you pay your rent on time, that doesn't affect your score one way or the other, up or down, your credit score. But this program's worked with the larger credit companies, and now if you're paying your rent on time, they've seen over the last 2 or 3 years they've been in existence, raising credit scores 50, 70, 100 points, which obviously is very significant when trying to get into home ownership. So again, just some really exciting tools out there for home ownership, or getting people into home ownership, or just returns and self-sufficiency. I'll kind of next move into, so that was kind of the acquisition side and some interesting programs. I'll kind of now move into development of new affordable units, and Mark gave some great examples and so forth. Maybe a show of hands. I won't spend a couple slides on low-income housing tax credits. Who's familiar with low-income housing tax credits in general? A good number of you very familiar with low-income housing tax credits. It is by far the largest production of affordable housing the last 30 plus years. It came around in 1986. Right before that was HUD, kind of the rental subsidy programs and so forth. But in 1986, low-income housing tax credits came around, and it's a public-private partnership, right? It's these incentives. Again, the policy is by bringing these tax credits, which are sold for equity, we can have a lower mortgage. You think about a single-family home, right? We think about 20% equity, 80% loan is kind of a typical structure. In these tax credit deals, without getting into too much detail, the federal government, through the IRS, gives these projects, they're scarce, we'll talk about that in a little bit, gives you tax credits, you sell to banks, it brings in equity, and now my mortgage only needs to be maybe 20 or 30% of the project. So almost a flip of your home scenario. Well, if my mortgage is that low, I can charge lower rents. And Mark referred to a number of projects of that case. So like the slide says, over 3 million units since 1986. Here in the state of Wisconsin, obviously where we're at, over 2,000 new units a year statewide are produced via this program. So it's a significant program. And then the nice thing too, there are many other both city, county, state, and federal programs that match very well with the low-income housing tax credit program. That's why and we talked about interest rates are as high as we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. Construction costs, we talk about that all the time. We see $220,000 a unit, $250,000 a unit, $300,000 a unit. We were working on projects just 10, 12 years ago where construction was $80,000 a unit. So construction costs has almost tripled in the last 10 years. So you think about that, how can I not raise rents if my construction costs rise? It's just math. People don't, we want to provide affordable, but it's difficult. I'm very excited that Pastor Peter is in the audience today. And do we have a microphone I could give Pastor Peter? I'm very excited. Many of you might know Pastor Peter and have seen what he's kind of working on 322 East Washington Avenue, and it's a lot about what Mark talked about, and you might have kind of see that schematic there. But I'd love to turn it over to Pastor Peter, really to talk about everything that Mark talked about, that we're talking about here. This is just a perfect case study for over here. Pastor Peter, sorry to put you on the spot.
Sure. Hi all. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see you all, and a big shout out to the City of Madison folks and the county folks and people on Don's own staff who've been so helpful. Mark and his project at Prez House has been a big inspiration for us. So St. John's has been in the heart of downtown Madison for 167 years now. On the same corner, our building has gone through a variety of iterations. We, like many of you, are a smaller, older congregation that owns prime real estate. I've done ministry on the East Coast and West Coast, and you drive by these gorgeous church buildings, and they're all luxury condos, which are great. I like luxury condos. They're beautiful, but they have no missional value. So St. John's wanted to make sure we didn't keep our existing building and have it ultimately become luxury condos for someone else. We decided we still own the property. We had no debt on the property. So big shout out to the City of Madison Common Council. They just approved our project with a lot of support from the Plan Commission and Urban Design. But we're building a high-rise 10-story building with 130 units of apartments, 110 of which are affordable, and there's a whole range between 30% AMI, which again, these are people who are your baristas at the coffee shops and who work at the laundromat, all the way up to market rate housing. If people get married, they get a promotion. You have that nice sense of community. It's keeping historically blue-collar, working-class neighborhood affordable for people. So happy to talk with you all. You have to know why you're doing it. You have to keep your vision, because it is a very circuitous, winding project, even when things work well. So, love to talk to you all over lunch.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Pastor. Yeah. That was very exciting. And it was kind of referred to a little bit as well as, some of the city of Madison priorities and kind of the focus on the planning and transit oriented. And we've talked about neighborhoods and how do we get density in neighborhoods. And so there's a lot going on and, talking to your alder, going to city planning meetings and so forth. But a lot of it is about how do I get density, new units, new unit types, and really kind of very much, transit oriented. You probably have all seen kind of this map. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but kind of our main arterials and so forth, where some of these density focus will be, towers. We might see, who knows, 8, 10, 12-story towers along some of these corridors. Obviously, East Washington's a prime example of that. So just, knowing, again, talking with the city, we talked about zoning, planning meetings, and so forth. I can't stress enough the importance of staying active and with your elected officials and so forth. Just, other examples of faith-based groups. This group is actually headquartered down in Milwaukee, but very active here in Dane County and around the state. Lutheran Social Services has both been a developer, providing supportive housing services. So again, kind of, assessing your strengths, assessing your goals. What do I have? I have land, probably. I have building. Do I have capital? We talk about down payment assistance. Am I interested in supportive housing services? Where is really your role as an organization, nonprofit, faith-based group, and so forth? I just spend a couple of slides talking about the low-income housing tax credit process, and I can get into a lot of details again. Again, please feel free to follow me up. This is what I do every day of my life, and I love it. So I can kind of fill you in a lot of details. But it's just really giving you an overview, right? We saw it. It's very powerful. It can provide 50 to 60% of your total capital. Like we talked about, it's hard to get new construction done, especially if your rents are lower. How do you get a mortgage and things of that nature? So really just a couple of really, really big overview points. WEDA, the Wisconsin Housing Economic Development Authority, is our state agency which administers the program. They kind of have a 2-year cycle. They come out with the rules of the game, which is called the Qualified Allocation Plan, and it has kind of priorities. We have different types of credits that you can apply for. There are, the most powerful credits, 9% credits, are very competitive. There might be 2 to 3 applications submitted per one awarded. But again, you can put a strategic application together. Applications actually just went in last Friday, so in January this year. Sometimes it's December or January. And the neat thing is, we talk about set-asides. You can compete. So just like projects, again, there's a scoring matrix, and I'll talk about it briefly, but you're competing against like projects. If you're preserving an existing project, you compete in the preservation set-aside. If you're a nonprofit, you're allowed to compete with other nonprofits. And so rural versus urban, you can kind of compete differently, so you're kind of competing. There is also a state credit, and we talked about also earlier, I think Kurt might have mentioned, talking, what you can do, again, to get resources. And the state credit's actually expiring next year. It's the 7th year of the credit, so there's a lot of actually state legislation and meetings going on, so that's something I'm kind of very involved in. Someone talked about, home ownership, and there's a home ownership credit at the federal level. So, believe me, affordable housing is both on everyone's tip of their tongue, both here at the state level and the federal level. There's a lot of proposed legislation, so that's something I'm definitely involved in, and definitely, again, talk to your both local and federal elected officials. Just some things if you were to consider, putting together a tax credit project next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. These are just things that you must absolutely have when you submit. First one, site control, just means you either own the land or have a purchase contract for the land. So you obviously can do with what you will with the property. Zoning, we talked about zoning. You must have permissive zoning, allowing multifamily housing at the level of units and so forth that you want. A site plan, so working with your architect to kind of show the layout of the building and the units and so forth. Back to kind of even the planning and pre-planning that Mark talked about a little bit earlier is, if housing is definitely what you want, you can contract with a market study professional. A market study, it might cost $3,000. A pre-market study might cost $3,000, and basically it's saying, hey, is this type of housing needed? I think, right? I've got land. I think we need housing, but Do I need housing? What are the demographics in my community versus this other community? You're part of the city, you're part of the county. And so it kind of looks at the demand. We talked, although I can pretty much say in Dane County unequivocally, there's a demand anywhere you are. Vacancies less than 2%, waiting list everywhere. So there's demand, but still probably, but even, is it family? Is it senior? Is it supportive housing? So even thinking about back to your mission and your goals, and that market study will help you kind of think through that. Even like what are achievable rents? I do want lower income rents. What are those rents at? As Pastor Peter mentioned, he has 30% units in 50s and market rates. What are all those rents at? So that's what that market study and a few other reports. If you're rehabbing, again, the interesting thing is you can use these tax credits to both build new, but you can find a building built in the 60s and preserve it and renovate it. Put 50 new HVAC systems, doors, windows, roofs, things of that nature, and kind of completely redo a project to make it beautiful and a place someone wants to live for the next 15 to 20 years. Just some items then we talked about that these credits, again, very powerful, 50-60% of your capital stack. They're competitive. What is the scoring criteria? And it can change, like I said, significantly every 2 years, although it's generally similar. And think about a lot of it, and that's really by the governor's office and through WIDA staff and so forth. But it's probably things that you as a resident, a place that you want to live and live nearby. So there's a heavy focus on location. You think about it: amenities, school districts, grocery stores, doctors' offices, parks, things. Senior centers. If it's a senior building, where do you want to build it? Obviously, there's an emphasis on sustainability, green. There's a lot. In the fall of 2022, even this is a quick sidebar, even for your existing church building, place of worship, the Inflation Reduction Act came out in the fall of 2022, and there's a lot around solar and geothermal and things like that. And for the first time, if you as a nonprofit or faith-based organization want to put solar on your roof, you can actually get you file your annual tax return, you can actually get a rebate on your solar. It was very interesting. Usually the solar, there's a credit, you'd have to find an investor. Now, no, you can get actually a rebate directly from the federal government, the IRS, for solar. So that's a whole nother discussion. Obviously solar, electric heat pumps, there's a lot of credits and incentives for green building on these commercial buildings, housing specifically, and then other commercial buildings. But again, for nonprofits, it's new as well. Again, that unit mix, you're incentivized to provide units to very low-income people. That's really at this 30% level, and also having the variety of units you score more for. Who's your development team? Do you have the track record? Can you get these deals done and so forth? So kind of looking at who you might partner with as an organization. There's 16 different scoring categories. I just kind of hit on a few of the highlights. And like I said, this program, low-income housing tax credits, pairs very well, and not only pairs well, but it needs a lot of other resources. As Pastor Peter mentioned, the city of Madison was very supportive of the project and has a commitment of funds, as does Dane County. Dane County has a very specific affordable housing funds. This is interesting here in Dane County, and some of you might have heard of this. I think it's 11 or 12 larger companies based here in Dane County realized, we talked earlier that how many jobs are in Dane County that people are driving from Janesville and Sauk City and other places. And so, the American Families and Monona Bank and groups like that, I don't want to leave anyone out, but about 11 companies said, we realize this is an issue. So they it's not a donation, but back to lower cost capital, they put money into a fund, about $10-11 million, that's being administered by a nonprofit here in Madison, that is looking at kind of filling gaps in workforce housing. Some of it could be tax credit housing, workforce. We talked about all the income levels. So it's kind of neat. We see employer-assisted housing. So that's something you could look at too as your organization. So that's here on the slide called the Dane Workforce Housing Fund. So where employers, so it's not only the federal government, the state government, the local government, employers are actually coming to the table as well with dollars. And then you might, it's like alphabet soup, right? TIF, home funds, AHP. There's just a lot, just the takeaway here, there's a lot of sources, and this is what I do, and it takes many projects. Unfortunately, back we talked about it should be simpler than this, right? It should be simpler, but it takes 5, 6, 7 sources of funds to build these places. It's not simple, unfortunately. Just this next slide, so I've talked about tax credits, and these are typically 30, 40, 50, 130, kind of more larger multifamily deals, and you say, hey, maybe I want to start with an 8 unit, right? So maybe tax credits aren't for me, but the city of Madison has their Housing Forward Fund, which is some low cost capital dollars for smaller neighborhood projects. Some of these other dollars, the Federal Home Loan Bank, again, I can fill you in a lot more details in all of these. The United Way has a small affordable housing fund to kind of give small subordinate loans. So there are dollars out there. Again, it's not easy. It's unfortunately going to a lot of different sources to put these together, but there are dollars out there. Sometimes the answer, unfortunately, is still no. It's tough right now with costs. Like I said, construction costs of $250, $280 a unit. We're maintaining a lot around $220 and so forth. So. Just to let you know, these tax credit deals, as I mentioned, I just looked at the last 5 years of awards, so they really are being funded. A lot of areas, because of the city of Madison and Dane County being very progressive in putting these pots of funds together that pair with tax credits, it's really helped a lot of projects. So if you are in one of these communities, the way weed is scoring, the soft funds, so there have been a lot of these awards, more awards probably in Dane County than actually Milwaukee, even though the population obviously is much larger in Milwaukee, again, because of the forward thinking of a lot of, thank you to the city of Madison, Dane County, and so forth. A lot of these deals are getting done, in the communities we live in here in Dane County. But then kind of wrapping up kind of the big picture, and some of these things are definitely that items that Mark had touched on is really what's next, and I love that the pre-planning I think is absolutely fantastic, because the way we thought about it is it's thinking back in the goals, what are the goals, who are you as an organization, your long-term goals, and it might take time, are your long-term goals, is it, hey, we want to support this, we will sell the land, and that meets our mission, and that's great because it's going to raise us funds. Do we want to have a long-term lease? Do we want to stay involved in this, for the long term? Do you want to is it affordable housing? As mentioned, grocery stores, daycare centers, who are we and what is our goal? Even back to specifically housing, we talked about family, senior, supportive housing. Is it homeless, transitional housing? I mean, there's so many different things. We talk about affordable, but really what is it? Knowing those types of things. And timelines, we talked about these timelines are long. I know, Mark talked about planning many, years in advance, and Pastor Pete talked about, thinking through the process, and even applying for funds can take 12, 24, 36 months. So, unfortunately, again, this is difficult, this is long, but kind of knowing that when you're talking about your decision-making process, probably, again, and even how do you make decisions, right? And maybe some of these are things you as an organization have never been through before. Is who and how and what council or person or individuals can make these decisions, right? Because these are some new decisions you might have never made before. Do know that, and I'm sure you do, having your land and these buildings is a very, very valuable resource, especially in today's environment. Again, if if you can use your existing building to repurpose, right? Some of it you might demolish the existing building. Maybe it's not conducive to housing or other commercial use. But if you are able to repurpose it, kind of repurposing existing building compared to paying $250,000 a unit for housing is very valuable. Land, right? We've all talked about Dane County land prices are high and only getting higher. So you've got valuable resources. Don't be make quick decisions, kind of think about the value you have and the value you can bring. And again, just that right? You are probably, we talked about this, you're community-oriented stakeholder. You hold a lot of value, you're very meaningful to your organization and so forth. So how does that factor in long-term? Yeah, I'll go through just a couple of these again, but again, it's all the pre-planning, the zoning, the market study that I talked about, the appraisal, just thinking about even if you're gonna lease the land, if you're gonna sell the land, what is the land worth? Just don't ask a couple people, probably get references on an appraisal to make sure you're getting valued and not taken advantage of. Then working on a financial feasibility model, is this even feasible? Am I way off base? Could this ever happen on my site? Do I need to partner with people? This industry, affordable housing, is so much about collaboration. And I like the point I think that Mark made is that kind of interfaith. I mean, this is all of us in this room working together, and it's all of us in the room. And I'm glad there's people from the city and maybe the state and the county and many faith-based, groups and nonprofits and a few for-profit. It's like it does take a village to kind of put these together, and so kind of understanding that. And then back to, right, you're maybe moving down the road, maybe you think the site works, maybe the use works, you have zoning, and then what do you do? How do you even partner with a real estate development company? Do you want to work with a for-profit? Do you want to work with a nonprofit? Do you want to work with another faith-based nonprofit? What's the mission? What's the competency of the groups you're going to work with? Requesting proposals. Sometimes people come up with a formal request for a proposal to find the right partner and get ideas and so forth. Talking with trusted advisors, talking with people who've done it before, getting a memorandum of understanding, and what will all the, who's going to do what work, what will all the financial terms, what are all the risks and rewards kind of associated with it. And then all morning we talked about different structures of what a partner might be like. Maybe the partner will be something that's called turnkey, is I'll kind of do all the work and kind of, give you, and it's your building. Maybe, right, I'm going to sell this to you, I'm going to lease back space. I'm going to keep a land lease on the land in perpetuity or 50 years, or am I really looking to generate cash today and selling assets? But even being, maybe selling assets or leasing land, and some of these developments, right? There are developer fees. Obviously, people do it for a business. There's ways you can maybe get a percentage of developer fees to generate cash, or even ongoing cash flow from these properties. So thinking about the goals and maybe understanding all the revenue sources that could develop from these affordable housing transactions. Do you have a larger property? Can you subdivide it? Maybe there's some home ownership, maybe there's rental. So kind of just thinking about really understanding the assets and really almost the highest and best use as well, and seeing how that aligns, with what you want to accomplish as your faith-based organization. And really just, I'm gonna kind of end on this, is really just back to public policy. And I know we're not all lobbyists and things like that, but if you are talking with any of your, again, elected officials, local, state, federal, they know it. They know housing is a need. I've heard it referred to not lightly as a pandemic, the need for housing, our communities in the country. And there are a lot of draft bills out there. There's so many competing, legislative priorities, but housing is super important. And when you get a project done, people love to visit what you've done. So those are my prepared remarks, and I appreciate being here. And again, please follow up. My contact information is here. Just to brainstorm, again, grab a cup of coffee. I love this, and it's important work, and it's important what you're all doing, and thanks for being here.
This is kind of specific, but I hope not too specific. My name is Miranda Hassett. I'm the rector of St. Dunstan's Episcopal on the west side of town. One thing some of our faith communities have is a rectory or housing associated with it, which was probably originally intended to house the pastor, may or may not still house the pastor. That's kind of a specific... I'm wondering about the possibilities for that very specific kind of redevelopment. I take to heart the idea that reworking an existing structure can be more cost-effective and also greener.
Yeah.
But that's not. They may or may not be an obvious candidate for breaking into multiple units. Has anybody done projects like that? Are there possibilities for creating a place that could accommodate multiple? We heard earlier that there are a lot of single adults who need housing who aren't necessarily in the student category. Like that particular kind of project, is there scope for that? Has anybody done stuff like that?
Yeah.
Turning over essentially what's functioning as a single family home, maybe not even in use, into, yeah.
That's a great question. And I think I've got a couple answers for that. Madison, this is interesting. And I think we need to explore all kinds of, living types, living arrangements and so forth. We've seen, and Madison has a long history of cooperative housing. And actually, we've seen 2 or 3 recent, I think, projects even starting construction. I know one on Jennifer Street, for example, taking 2 houses on Jennifer Street, single-family houses, kind of combine, it's kind of cool, combining, actually like digging underground, combining the basements, getting this master kind of kitchen and so forth. So I could see, is that the right spot for it? Maybe, maybe not, but cooperative housing where you have, singles and so forth is one type. Or even, again, could, a rectory is probably a 2-story, probably some good square footage. Could you make 2 or 3 units out of it, something like that, using some funds? So I think it's worthwhile brainstorming those types of assets. Yep. Great question.
I'm just wondering if there's anything specific with how the church tax, how churches are taxed, the property of churches are taxed. Does that affect the tax buyback plan that you were explaining? How do those 2 things interface?
Yeah. So, in these projects, I'll kind of break it into maybe 2 buckets. If at the end of the day, I talked a lot about low-income housing tax credits. Those, unfortunately, well, I won't say unfortunately, but our own, because we have this outside investor with equity coming in, those become for-profit taxable entities, if you will, and those do pay real estate taxes. If you do have, though, 100% nonprofit-owned affordable housing here in the state of Wisconsin, kind of by the real estate tax code, those properties can remain real estate tax-free. So there's some nuances with that, but yeah.
Thanks. A lot to chew on here.
Yeah.
And I would just say the tax exemption that churches bring to the table allows for a more affordable impact, to have a deeper impact on permanent affordability. So as you're doing the kind of concurrent planning, you ought to be looking at what is the impact you're after, how deep you're after, and using that tax exemption and maintaining it as a tool within the auspices of permanent affordability. You brought up LIHTC a lot. It is the biggest game in town, if not almost the only game in town. Yet, it's important to think, yes, we need to fix LIHTC and make it better, but we also need to create the next system of financing permanent affordable housing. If you look at the current status quo generated by LIHTC, it ain't so good. And LIHTC ultimately is a Reagan-era supply-side economic tool for wealthy people to make money off of affordable housing. And, in my mind, it's a bit broken, and because the costs are so enormous, it absorbs, almost like a vacuum, all the other city, county funds available for housing. How do we start to build the next system with land banking and other tools? And then the only other thing, because there's a lot of thoughts in my head, as we're in the pre-planning process, how do you look at the populations you want to serve and really think about designing high-quality, customized supportive services so that you can serve probably a traumatized population as effectively as possible, so that the long-term permanence of that housing is kind of the pathway to the affordable home ownership of some of those populations, such as the young families. Other populations, that might not be the outcome, but there's a lot of longitudinal thinking that's going to go into this and how we move forward. So this system, yes, but the next system for sure.
Perfect. No, thank you for those. Yep.
This problem with the LIHTC program might have been corrected at this point. I haven't been involved with it in a really long time, but in the earlier days of that program, it doesn't necessarily create permanent housing, right? It can be, once the mortgage is paid off or whatever, the developer can sell it, and that therefore there's no other affordable housing there, correct?
Now, as a best practice, these will be at least 30 years. So we have a 30-year land use restriction agreement that we still must remain for. After 30 years, that can go away. Yeah. California, I think, has gone to 99 years, actually. So, yeah.
Yeah, and to add to that, the city of Madison generally, the city of Madison will also add stipulations as well if they're providing funding. But to continue this conversation with faith-based communities, I think one of the most important assets, and often an asset that gets overlooked when you deal with anybody just dealing with property development. As a nonprofit property developer, I have a lot of trouble looking at a story to tell. I just want to get housing up. What you as faith-based community members have that's really, really important is a really cool story. You get to take what your community, your church, your faith community's mission is, and turn that into the project that you want to see and the legacy you want to leave. And I think that that's something too, though, that financial institutions do value. I mean, having a very cool story. I was introduced to the building, the Soldiers Home building in Milwaukee. If you ever get the chance, it is a for-profit developer, but I do think that they're not all scary boogeymen. There are some good ones out there that are doing really cool work. And I think the Soldiers Home property is a really cool example. It was one of the last buildings built by the Lincoln era presidency and turned into a veterans home. It's gorgeous. I highly recommend taking a look at it. But the cool piece with that was it wasn't just an affordable housing project. It was an affordable housing story, and it was something that the community could carry on. And I think that's one of the big takeaways that you as faith institutions have, is you have this capacity to start writing what that story is and make sure it doesn't leave, because I think so much of that can get lost in this process. And I would wager a guess that a building or two has come around where there was a great idea at the beginning and it fell off because somebody wasn't there to write the rest of that story.
Sure.
And so it's important for these communities to take that time, establish what you want that story to be, and carry that through this process. So,
Great advice. Yep.
Thanks so much for your talk today. So WIDA, of course, has a lot of power when it comes to how and why things are built. With working with primarily refugee populations and housing, compliance standards that property managers set is a barrier that we come up against quite a bit.
Yeah.
We can often get past background checks because the refugee admissions program is the most extensive, intense background check. But when it comes to things like, second moves or housing transitions, families that want to live in higher quality housing, families who absolutely are the candidates for tax credit housing, we're finding they're not meeting those 3 times income ratio, or those 3-time income requirements, right? So, and it's just, like we've talked about all day, there's a lot of families that are paying at least half their income for rent. That's what it is right now, right? But what role does WIDA have in increasing those opportunities and shifting things when it comes to compliance, or what's required to even get in to these properties? What does that look like, and what's the potential there?
That's a great question. I know, and I don't know, Julie, would you be able to prepare like some of the requirements of what you're looking for, like with tenant selection and things like that? I think the city of Madison has kind of started really leading that. Would you mind talking a second or two?
Raise your hand.
Yep.
Thanks, folks. I'm Julie Spears with the City of Madison's Community Development Division and the lead on the RFP that we run each year to provide support for these developments, such as St. John's. We do have a tenant selection plan best practices that we've put together to help guide the property management in those developments. But I do think folks from the faith community can potentially have an influence on items in WIDA's QAP along these lines, helping folks get into this housing. One item I know that we advocated for at the city this last year was a rent increase limit. And I was super pleased to see that they just came out with a rent cap on the rent cap, because as those incomes are going up, and then the rents are going up so exponentially in these last few years especially, it makes it even harder for folks, at least on their renewals, to stay in. And so those are not hard and fast requirements that we have in there. They're best practices because every property management company is different, and there's a few, usual suspects that do the majority of the work in this community. But the power really is in WIDA, I think, in many ways to lay down the law and what those limits are to help make sure that everybody is implementing those requirements across the board uniformly and making that an even playing field. Otherwise, it generally does not get done.
I think, one thing, and that's a great point, Julie, and WIDA, to their credit, Wisconsin, again, it's not nearly enough. Wisconsin produces more tax credit units at the 30% rent, so again, than really any other state, because it was a priority, and they listened to kind of the housing community. So to your point, talk to WIDA, they don't obviously make every change, they've got a lot of constituents, but as Julie said, that's probably a good way to start.
And to follow through, I think occupancy is another huge thing. Like, I think, Western world, everyone needs their own bedroom.
Yeah.
But that's just not aligned with reality of double up households,
Right.
multi-generational households.
Yep.
And so to say that only 6 people can live in a 3-bedroom, which oftentimes property managers are going outside the bounds of what the actual city's fire code is, right?
Right.
And saying, oh, well, this is what's in our compliance book. And well, we can't do anything about, so occupancy is another thing that
Sure.
we can work on.
Yeah.
See that as a bigger
Make
picture.
a little bit, yeah. Good.
For the folks on the live stream, there was just lots of conversation there about occupancy and fire codes, and definitely more chat to be had about that over lunch and in the afternoon. So lots of nuance here. Other questions? We've just got a few more minutes before lunch is ready. Okay.
I don't know if this is a question or who
Sure,
to ask
sure.
also, since you're talking about tripled income. My question is security deposit, rental, like first month's, last month's rent. I've noticed a high increase of people asking for $3,000 to $4,000 to move into a place
Oh,
in
wow.
Sun Prairie,
Oh, wow.
Madison, Dane County. And I wonder, how can the city of Sun Prairie find funding to offer rental support? Because I feel like that's a huge barrier for people to get into housing. I don't know if you could answer that or give us brainstorming
Yeah.
ideas, because that's what I
Yeah.
fall into.
Yeah.
Core is an option, but that takes 45 days
Okay.
to 60, and landlords don't want to wait.
Yeah. I don't know. I know, I can grab your contact information afterwards. There's a couple nonprofits we work with that do a lot of back to, right, how do I even get utility hookups and things like that, right? If I don't know any source right now, but I will look into that. Yep. Down payment, or not down payment, but kind of the deposit kind of thing.